Welcome to the Legal Academy, Episode 7. I'm your host, Orin Kerr. My guest this week is Meera Deo, a professor at Thomas Jefferson Law School, and also the director of the Law School Survey of Student Engagement based at Indiana University. Meera had her undergraduate studies at UC Berkeley, go Berkeley, JD at University of Michigan, and then earned a PhD in sociology at UCLA in 2009. She practiced public interest law for a few years before joining the Academy. Meera has been a visiting professor or visiting scholar at several California law schools, including UC Berkeley, UCLA, UC Irvine, and UC Davis. And Meera came to my attention when I read her really fantastic book. We're going to talk a lot about her book, and I have it right here for those watching the YouTube version, Unequal Profession, Race and Gender in Legal Academia. And I read this book in the fall when I saw a reference to it online, and I found this incredibly useful and incredibly insightful, and I learned so much from it. I was really excited to have you, Meera, on the show. So please welcome to the Legal Academy.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I was thrilled to get your invitation over email, and I think we really haven't had a chance to interact until now. The only interaction that I think we've had so far was a spectacular one for me, which is perhaps around the time you were first reading the book. You gave a talk at a law school in Los Angeles, and I was visiting at Davis this past year, and I was scheduled to give a talk at the same school the following week. And so the law school put out a tweet of a picture of your talk and how great it was, and said that I was up on deck, the following week. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, and I'm new to Twitter, but I tweeted it out again, and I said, what a hard act to follow, because I was, pretty impressed to be going the week after you. I've been an admirer of your work for a long time. You know how...
Your book is a lot better than the article I presented, for the record.
You know how sophomores kind of look up to juniors, and you kind of know who they are, and you're always impressed with what they're working on, what they're doing. And you, within hours, responded and said, with literally a picture of you holding my book, and said, you have the book, you're reading the book, and you wish you could attend my talk. So I thought that was very gracious. And now here we are.
Here we are. Yeah, I'm super excited. So let's get into it, because this book really, really is interesting. And I'm tempted. Let me give my sort of paragraph summary of what the project was, and then you get into kind of what you found. So this was an empirical study, or the basis of it, sort of the core of it, is this empirical study of 63 women of color at law schools, and then a reference point of another 30 professors from other groups. And it was really sort of trying to get their experience in the legal academy out there, sort of interviews. And if I understand, there was first a survey, and then an interview that was maybe an hour long or so on average, talking to people about their experiences joining the academy, dealing with colleagues, dealing with students, tenure, and sort of getting the perspective of voices that you don't hear enough from out there. And so it was so exciting is to be able to hear these perspectives and see not only just one or two people like an anecdotal thing, but 63 people's perspectives thrown together. So that's it. And I want to now jump into let people know what you found. So what's kind of take it away. What's sort of the gist of what you found in your book?
Well, you provided a pretty useful summary, especially covering who was included in the book. And so, as you said, there were 93 people altogether in the project, and the core sample is women of color, and it's exactly for the reasons you've mentioned, to highlight the voices of people who tend to not be as included in legal academia, and that's both numerically and in terms of the actual experience. And so while the numbers are small, and I think many people have noticed that over the years, there hasn't until now been a formal empirical study of the experiences of law faculty that centers women of color and provides these reference points, because I did include men of color, white men, and white women. And that delves into the actual experiences of law faculty members from all over the US, from new hires to, I have a dean emeritus in the study, so it really does attempt to cover sort of all of these broad bases. And so in terms of some of the findings, the book itself sort of chronologically follows the trajectory of a law professor. And so, a lot of it deals with the actual experience of interactions and relationships that are formed in law school. Some of these are with colleagues, some of these are with students. There are challenges with both groups in the sense that a lot of the women in my study, white women as well as women of color, expressed some difficulty in terms of being taken seriously by their colleagues. They complained of mansplaining and what I called in the book and others have called heap-eating, and silencing, especially in faculty meetings and those sorts of issues. And then similar pushback in some ways from students who were maybe not prepared to find somebody who looks different than what they had expected their law professor to look like, standing in front of the classroom on the first day of class teaching, torts or criminal law. And so, sort of challenged the professor in some ways to prove their authority, to show that they really were kind of worth the money, right, of what students are now investing in law school. And then there are really interesting parallels as well with regard to hiring and leadership. The hiring process as a whole is a challenging one, in part because there are a lot of unwritten rules. And so many of the candidates on the market, unless you have a mentor to guide you, it's really hard to know what's right from wrong. And so, I had somebody who said that she filled out the FAR form, for example, which is the faculty appointments recruitment form. And, it said, what classes would you be most interested in teaching? And she sent it after she had turned it in, she sent it to a professor she had gone to law school with. And there's this great example where, he calls her on the phone and he's like, you don't put race and law as your, the class you're most interested in teaching. You pick a first-year subject. And yet, for most people, if you ask somebody, what are you interested in? You genuinely share your interests, not knowing perhaps that schools are going to be especially interested in hearing about a match between what your interests are and what their real needs are. And often for schools, that's, a connection to a first-year curriculum course. And I say that there's a parallel with leadership because in the same way that for a lot of law professors who are women and especially women of color, many didn't really anticipate going down this route. Certainly not in law school, usually not for the first few years of practice even. And so, interestingly, there's this question about, is this a place where I belong? I don't really see myself here. Maybe this isn't for me. And so similarly with leadership, most of the women in my sample, gave some version of, ugh, I would never want to be a dean, right? And there's a real lack of interest in formal administrative leadership positions. But my job, of course, as a sociologist, as an empiricist, is to kind of dig a little deeper to try to get at the why. And so once you do that, it turns out many of the, even senior scholars say, I don't really feel like I belong in administration. They're looking at the ways in which some of their colleagues have, thought about where they might fit in, and they've internalized some of that as well. So that now there's this sense of, well, I guess administration's not really for me. Even though many of these women could be really successful leaders in the legal academy as well.
So let me. Your book, as you point out, does go kind of chronologically through the career of a professor, and I wanted to focus in chapter one. I thought, which was maybe one of the. I mean, there were a bunch of these chapters I thought that were super interesting, but the AALS hiring process and that initial process of becoming a law professor. You point out, as I think you mentioned just a minute ago, that there's a significant difference in how people decided to try to become law professors, with the typically, this is generalizing, of course, but white men were more likely to have decided years earlier, this is kind of what I want to do, and sort of lay the process down and see themselves as somebody who wanted to become a law professor, for a while. And women of color, the ones that were in the survey, were much more likely to have not had that on the radar screen. It's where someone recommended it to them, or they, late in the going decided that was something that was interesting. And that's such an interesting difference, I think, because people may underappreciate how much of a benefit it is to have the years of thinking about it, laying the foundation for it, getting articles, having this professor be a recommender, that they're sort of putting together the package is something that takes years when done most effectively. And somebody who's thinking about this fairly late is going to be at a disadvantage, and that was I thought incredibly interesting. And I was hoping you could say a little bit more about that. You included a couple quotes in the book, but even just more to give a flavor for what. Why is it the case that people are not thinking about that because they have other kind of specific thoughts in mind? They want to go into public interest law or want to practice at a firm or what sort of the extent you can say maybe this is just too much of a granular detail to sort of tease out of the data, but what is the experience? Give us a little bit more of a sense of the mindset of, the sort of late decision. What is the process where is it really like the mentor professor who's saying, you should do this, let me put this on your radar screen, or is that just one of several ways that comes to mind?
Yeah, I found this really fascinating too. And so I did ask a lot of questions about this particular point. So I think I do have answers to a lot of the things you're bringing up. Most women of color, while they're in law school, do have a plan. For most of them, it's to do government or public interest work or to work at a firm. In terms of, I'm not talking about women of color as a whole who are in law school. I'm talking about those who end up as law professors, right?
Right.
That's who I include in the sample. So
Right.
most of them had a plan. They thought they knew what they wanted to do, and most of them did that. And there are very few women of color. I don't know if I have any in my sample who went straight. I don't think I have any in the sample who went straight from law school to teaching. I think there were maybe 2 out of the 63 who knew in law school that they wanted to become law professors.
Interesting.
But as you said, a lot of the white men in the sample knew very early on. They see professors who look like them. They feel like maybe that's something I could do too. Some of these professors reach out to students and tell them directly, hey, have you ever thought about teaching? Let's think about working on a project together. Would you be interested in being a research assistant? Nowadays, a lot more schools have TAs even to, help teach a class. That didn't exist when I was in law school 20 something years ago, but now I think that's another avenue to pursue, at least a way of thinking about this as a path. So for a lot of the women of color, many of them go into, law firm life after law school, partly for economic reasons. Many of these women of color are responsible for kind of the economic sustainability of their immediate family, their extended family, and they really contribute significantly to their communities as well. And so, thinking even when they're at a firm job and somebody, reaches out to them multiple times to say, hey, maybe you want to consider law teaching, for many of the women, it's a difficult choice, especially because they know they're, giving up a pretty lucrative career as a law firm lawyer, to make a, I think, comfortable salary as a law professor, but not nearly at that same level. And, when you think about spreading it out further than just one person or one nuclear family, but to parents, in-laws, extended family members, it's a lot more difficult to walk away once you've sort of built the expertise at a firm. So I think those are all, parts of it. The first chapter in the book, and for a long time, I changed I think the title now is Barriers to Entry, but for a long time the title was The Accidental Law Professor, because it's probably the most common quote. People, so many women in the sample, and especially women of color, who say, I just got lucky, I just fell into this job, I wasn't planning on doing this. And often it took a mentor sort of pushing them into it. Although, sometimes it's clear that people don't have mentors too. There's a Native American woman named Jennifer who I talk about in the book. All the names in the book are pseudonyms, of course, in the study. But she, decided to sort of try out being a professor at a local school. She was already working in the city, and she thought, she saw an ad for a visiting job, and she was like, let me try this out. So she tries out being a visitor, loves it, and then thinks, okay, maybe this is something I can do full time permanently. And 2 senior scholars at her school, who she thinks of as mentors, come into her office and say, we hear you want to do this full time. We want to hire you. Don't go on the market. Do not look at the AALS hiring process at all, because we want to hire you. We don't want somebody else to take you away. And for her, she was really flattered. She thought, well, what great news that they want to hire me here. She was married. Her husband had a really good job in the city they were in. And she thought, well, this is so convenient, right? And so she says directly, I didn't think of it as this big strategy in the way that we were just talking about a moment ago, where you lay your whole package out. She just thought, I like this job. I'm here already. It seems, convenient. And now I feel really lucky that I fell into this. Now, of course, we don't know what she might have given up by not
Right.
even considering, right, what some other options might have been.
I hear the story and it reminds me of the advice when you're selling a car, never sell to the dealer, right? Because you're sort of selling it's easy, but you're selling yourself short. So as you say, the natural strategy question comes to mind. But I mean, it's just incredibly interesting to think of that kind of as a systematic difference of worldview and how that will play out, repeated again and again. Obviously, there's generalities and averages here, but you can imagine that having just a huge impact on how people on how careers play out. I wanted to turn to I think it's the next chapter on relationships with colleagues, how people interact with colleagues. And one of the findings you had in the chapter was that there are differences between how people are feeling about their colleagues. Is this a great environment? Are people friendly? Is this sort of a happy place to work? Do I like my colleagues? Those sorts of questions that I forget exactly how you phrased it, but there were just differences in terms of how happy people were with their colleagues and how they felt about their colleagues. And I was hoping you could say more about especially in the interview context, sort of remembering all the interviews you did. How, what kinds of things were the key differences that people had in terms of their experiences, which produced that change in attitude?
So, a lot of law professors and faculties as a whole talk about being collegial. That's a term that comes up, I think, a lot when you're going through the hiring process, for example.
Sure.
And so it's true, even in my research, people talked about how they have a generally collegial faculty. It's like this term that I think many of us feel compelled to use, right? In terms of how would you describe your colleagues? Oh, everybody gets along fine. But again, asking sort of more pointed questions, it turns out that for women of color, there's a lot more distrust behind that collegiality. So, on a superficial level, I think it's true that people at many law schools tend to generally get along. But that's really just at a superficial level. When you dig a little deeper, when you look, as I write about it, behind the mask of collegiality, sometimes there is some underlying hostility, and this comes out in different ways. And it's hard to say, what the root cause of that is. There are some institutions. There's only one woman in the sample as a whole who left legal academia. She was in her, what we often call a terminal year. When she participated in the interview with me, which means that she had applied for tenure, been denied, and given an opportunity to stay for one final year to kind of, get all her professional affairs together before she was leaving the school. She was hired as part of an effort by the dean and some others to add greater levels of diversity to their faculty. This was a school that had very few faculty of color. And while there were a few very committed colleagues, there were others who were really opposed to sort of focusing on diversity as a criteria or a rationale or a priority, really, for the school. And so these colleagues, when she was hired, opposed her hiring, and they were in the minority, so she still got hired, but those colleagues vowed to block her opportunity for tenure no matter what. So they were like, okay, fine, you're going to hire her. Obviously, you have the numbers. We can't win, but we're not going to let her get tenure here. And that they said they would do it early on, and they did it. And she ended up leaving the school, leaving academia altogether. And so, when you look, I'm sure some of those colleagues, treated her in a cordial way, especially publicly, even though they had, kind of a broader priority or goal in mind for her career ultimately. And then there are others, who kind of at, various ends of the spectrum. A lot of the people in my research talk about the fabulous mentorship that they receive from colleagues, even at their own schools. And even, from faculty members who don't look at all like them or share their background or share many of their experiences. A lot of the women of color are very clear that while they rely on people from a similar background for, social support and emotional support. My PhD dissertation is about various forms of social capital among membership in different types of student organizations. So I have thought about this a lot in the past, and it's relevant here too. So you draw on people who are like you for support, but they also talk about the ways in which people who are very different from them have really been sponsors and allies, and helped promote them in their careers long term. So, you don't necessarily need to match as a mentor or mentee with somebody who, is like you, whatever that means, or who reminds you of yourself, or who is similar to you. You'll probably find some other similarities on the way. And then there's the flip side, of course, too, where, there were people in my study, one woman who said there's a faculty member who has literally never acknowledged my existence. Like, early on, I would walk down the hall and say hi, and he just ignored me, and I was mortified. And now we just pretend like each other don't exist. And so that kind of thing is happening at some schools as well. But I think at most schools, there is at least a superficial collegiality. There are some with whom even non-traditional faculty members have a really strong rapport and can rely on one another for support. And then other schools where, it's just less clear unless you dig a little deeper to see what's going on.
Yeah, I've in talking to friends who happen to be women of color, it's interesting the sort of sense of certain schools are going to be more friendly or more, are more ready for women of color faculty members. Other schools are known as more difficult or hostile even places to be. And there was that whole level of thinking about institutions which just had never occurred to me. And it was so interesting in sort of hearing from friends like this school versus that school, and even just like knowing a history of tenure decisions at different schools, things that I just never occurred to me to even think about. Whereas my friends in this context who are women of color were like, yeah, this school is known for this school, and there was sort of a history of institutions which I was just completely clueless about. And of course, once I heard it, I was like, oh, I really should have known about this. I should have known about this different experience. And I just was, writing my articles and completely clueless about this going through my life. So, so a lot of that.
Also, I mean, it's also a question of, how would you know, right? Just like we were talking about before. And so the additionally interesting thing about, there's seems to be that some people are in the know about this. It's almost like a need to know, right? Like, does this person need to know this information? Because there's a community out there, and that community will hopefully, if you can tap into it, we will educate you about some of that information. Which isn't to say that you would not have wanted to know that information too. I think that, it's probably useful information for lots of people. But there is a community too that does bolster and support and really encourage junior scholars, aspiring faculty members too.
And that was really, I think, what was so great about the book, is I felt a little bit like I was being, read into a classified program, right? It's like, here's this world that you can get if you're asking if you're asking questions and you want to know and you're sort of like looking for it. But what's so great about it is here you're sort of reporting, here's the experience of a large number of people, and there's a common theme here, and there's sort of a worldview that a lot of people are just totally missing. So I thought that was what was so powerful about it, is that you don't need to be friends with someone who trusts you, who says this is the experience. It can be, you pick up the book and you get it. So just incredibly helpful. I also wanted to talk about, I think it was chapter 3, on how the people you had interviewed interacted with students and their experience, and how that was different. Part of this being about teaching evaluations, which we talked about in an earlier episode of the show with Sarah Losky, about how the consistent biases in teaching evaluations. But it went beyond teaching evaluations. So I was hoping you could talk about that chapter as well.
Yeah. So what I found really interesting about interactions with students is there's this kind of strange, fascinating paradox. So the first part of it is that the vast majority of women, and especially women of color, with whom I spoke, talk about students as the best part of the job. And so in one of the questions, I didn't say, how much do you like your students? But it was very open-ended. I just asked them to talk about what the best thing is about their law school. And just as an example, I got, there's so many to choose from. But I have Martha, who says students are the best part of the job, really. Laura, who's a Native American, says, oh, well, of course your relationship with students is one of the best parts about the job. Zara agrees the best thing about the school is the students. They're really smart and I enjoy interacting with them. And then Grace, I love my students as a general matter. I always have. And so it was very common for me. This was a very clearly identifiable pattern in the data, that women of color feel a really strong connection to students. Now, before I conducted this research with faculty members, I had been working for a decade or so on the law student experience and thinking about access as well as experiential issues for law students, and especially non-traditional law students. And so I know from that research that students from all backgrounds do gravitate towards women of color faculty, and women faculty as a whole. Basically anyone who's sort of non-traditional in any way, right? They tend to see them as more accessible, more approachable. They're on campus more. They have a reputation for being available to students. And initially I thought, well, the black students are probably going to go to the black professor. But it turns out all students figure out like these professors are going to be available to us, and so everybody goes to them. So on the one hand, we have these professors saying, I love my students, that's the best part of the job. But of course, all the students are coming to them. And so what that might mean, and what it does mean for many of the women of color professors who are filling that role, is that they are overburdened then by service work. If you imagine all the students at the school want to see what is usually on most campuses a handful of professors, right? Like maybe 3 to 6, if you're at a more diverse school, faculty members. Well, that's going to take away time from that professor to work on scholarship, to work on teaching, to do the things that tend to be most rewarded and recognized at a school. And so, it might be that she really does love meeting with students, but of course, more and more of her day and her week is going to be taken up with those student meetings, which is going to make it harder for her to get the scholarship done that she needs to do to get tenure, right? Or to get other sorts of recognition at her school. Now, the third part of this paradox is the one that I find, probably obviously the most problematic, but also really challenging in ways to explain. And that's that while women of color as a whole have a great relationship with students as a whole, there may be, 2 students or 3 in a classroom who sort of act on this presumption of incompetence. Is this a professor who really knows her stuff? How can I sort of throw a wrench in here to see, how will she respond if I throw out a question like this? And also to sort of display that level of privilege in evaluations, right? Where for women of color, they tend to focus substantially on physical appearance, believe it or not, even more than pedagogical approach or teaching effectiveness. And so many of the women of color, even senior scholars, could remember, things from 30 years before, and some of them are deeply problematic, like one black woman who had a student write, "She's black, enough said." Right? So how do you respond to that? And these are women who tend to care a lot about their teaching. And so I had people talk about that too, right? I care so much about getting across to the students. But if I'm getting comments like this in my evaluations, they're not actually constructive, right? There's no suggestion of, could you post your slides in advance? I'm not getting comments like that. I'm getting comments like, why doesn't she wear her wedding ring? Is she trying to tease us? Right? Or another one that said, she flips her hair over her shoulder too much. Right? So how is this related to your ability to teach effectively in the classroom? Right. And like I said, this is, it tends to be just a very small handful of students. And yet, as any of us who's been the person in the front of the room with a student who's disruptive in any way can attest, it really just takes one student to kind of throw off a lesson a little bit, or to take up time, because I tend to not ignore any of my students. If a student has a question that I think is inappropriate or off base, or just maybe not really relevant, I still will take a moment to respond. And certainly for women of color, when part of what that challenge is about trying to control the professor or see if the professor herself can control the classroom, well, then of course you have to take time to respond. So, when that happens, I think a lot of professors see that, they're 90% of the students in the classroom are kind of rolling their eyes about it too, right? They know, oh, here goes this person again, saying this thing, and now it's going to waste all of our time because the professor has to respond. But that's in spite of the fact that overall, still, teaching and that student interaction tends to be most women of color's favorite thing about being a law professor. So for me, I find it a very strange paradox that overall it's wonderful, but then it creates extra burdens. And yet these two or three people, it's not just a question of if I get, the last Civ Pro class I taught had about 70 students, I think. And, let's say I got one negative teaching evaluation in that bunch. It's not like, oh, I just got one negative teaching evaluation. And, this is my 12th year of teaching. And so it doesn't affect me now as much or in the same way. But for a junior scholar who gets, two or three of these, it can really derail a professional career as a whole. I would say, there's a later chapter in the book that deals with tenure and promotion. And I mentioned there that, at least among the sample, challenges with students, especially in terms of student evaluations, were the primary reason given for those who were denied promotion or denied tenure. Wow. It does not meet expectations in teaching, right? Or however your school chooses to term that. And often that can be, just a very few number of students who can create that result.
Wow, fascinating. So I wanted to turn to the conclusion of the book where you talk about sort of what can law schools do? Because the natural reaction I had in reading the book, and I'm sure many people have had in reading the book, is every chapter sort of is about certain systemic problems that law schools are having, and so it naturally makes you think like, okay, what can law schools do? What can we do to make this better? And you go into some of these ideas in the conclusion, but I wanted to sort of get into that and more. Kind of one thing I think that just in the course of reading it, obviously being aware of these dynamics is one enormous step, right? You're not going to be able to address these problems unless you're aware of them. So read the book is maybe the one key piece of advice. But beyond that, kind of what can schools do? I think some schools are aware of these dynamics more than others, but what are changes schools can make? Is it just culture? Are there policies schools can enact to try to improve the situation your book has revealed?
Yeah, absolutely. And in the book, I sort of separate these out into individual strategies and sort of broader structural solutions. And individual strategies are things like, what can you personally do to have a better experience for yourself or create a better environment for your colleagues? And, that can take a number of formats, whether it's sort of talking your colleagues up. This actually isn't in the book. One of the wonderful things about doing so many book events and talking to so many people about the book, even though it's already out, is that I get so much good feedback from folks about their own experiences. And so, one woman of color, for example, told me that when she was hired, her dean during orientation talked her up. That's it. I think, he took 15 seconds maybe to say, Professor Jones is joining us this year, and if you're in her criminal law class, you are lucky because so many schools wanted her, and we figured out a way to make it work for us. And if you're not lucky enough to get her this year, you can take some upper level courses with her in the years to come. But we are really excited that she's here. It doesn't take very long, and yet it can have such a profound effect because here's this person, who has, according to the students, at least all this power at the law school, using some of his capital to talk up someone who, the students might otherwise be very unsure about. So there are lots of individual things that we can do. But in terms of structural solutions, one of them, since we talked a little bit about hiring, I'll mention that one that I think is really powerful and similarly, not necessarily that complicated, is just thinking about ways that you can think outside the box for hiring. So, right now, most schools hire through the AALS recruitment process. And I think if we continue using the process that we've been using, we'll probably be likely to continue getting the results that we've been getting. And so if you want something different, you might have to go out and try to find something different. And so one of the women in my sample talked about how the newest scholar at her school is a woman of color who was hired because their associate dean went to like a local intellectual property bar association meeting. And so, the associate dean was probably the only academic at this meeting, but she kind of went to scout it out, right? They needed an IP person, and she thought, let me go and see who's here. And so she met some people at the meeting. She found this one particular person who she thought, I think she could, be a fabulous colleague. She seems really engaged in the kinds of things we do as an academic community. So they invited her to do, just an initial screening interview. She was invited back for a job talk, and then she joined the faculty. And so, this is someone who was never interested and never had considered being an academic, but ultimately is this productive, wonderful scholar in this institution because somebody, happened to go to this IP practitioners meeting and met her there. So I think that's, one really useful option. Another one is, what you're saying in terms of just educate ourselves. And I think for myself, I mean, less, I think that the climate that we're in now is one where a lot of people who, maybe for the past few years have been willing to say we care about diversity are now going to do something about diversity. In addition to saying they care about it, they might put some action behind it. I don't know yet what that action is going to be. I think those are just starting. I've seen like on the CivPro listserv, people who are like, hey, what kinds of more inclusive cases can we be talking about? And I certainly see all of that as positive, right? Those are positive developments. And then what's the next step? What more can we do? So for me, this is less about sort of formal diversity trainings and more about thinking through things we maybe already know that might be uncomfortable to think about. So Marisol, who's a Latina in the sample, has this great quote where she's like, do our evaluations really effective? I've been trying to educate my colleagues about this. And so what I think we should do is ask ourselves, right? Like if you're looking at somebody's set of evaluations and they're not great, right? It's a woman of color, a junior scholar, and they're not as great as you feel like they could be or should be. Right. So she says, we should ask ourselves, do your evaluations suck because you suck as a teacher, or is there something else going on? Right? So when you're aware of the potential for systemic bias, you might take those evaluations with a grain of salt. It doesn't mean you have to throw them out altogether. We also, I think, can do a better job of crafting our evaluations. So, I always give as an example, like, as far as I know, my 1L students, by the end of the year, everything they know about civil procedure is what I've taught them about civil procedure. And yet they tend to get asked a question, about my mastery of the material. Well, I don't know how well they can evaluate, how much I know about CivPro, because really all they know is what I've chosen to share with them.
Right.
Now, they are experts at, do I do a good job of fostering an inclusive classroom? They really are in the best position to answer a question like that. Or do I treat every student with respect? There's really nobody better suited to answer a question like that than my actual students. And so thinking a little more carefully about how we ask questions, what's important to us as a faculty, and what certain people are able to evaluate. Most schools have, as part of the tenure and promotion process, colleagues sit in to evaluate classes. Those colleagues, if a CivPro professor comes to sit in on my class, yeah, you can ask that person, does she seem like she knows her stuff? Because that person also knows his or her stuff. And they may not be as well suited to answering whether I'm treating every student with respect. They might not see it from the same perspective as the student. And so thinking about how we can gather that information, I mean, this is, again, right, as a data person, I feel like let's actually ask the questions that we're most interested in getting answers to, and the ones that, we're going to be able to get really useful data. Let's ask students about their own experience in the classroom. And then, that I think could be more useful.
It sounds like a lot of the changes, or some of the most important changes, are really culture ones, awareness ones, and the teaching evaluation changes, I think, are consistent with that, right? It's sort of like, let's make sure we understand what the data is and what it means, and sort of the biases in it, and try to think about better data we can collect, and just put this in context in a way that maybe people didn't put it in context in the past. Do you have a sense, should can we help students understand those dynamics for classroom purposes, or is that something that's too hard to do? You mentioned sort of the role of diversity training, and maybe that wasn't the answer as much. Or I guess when I'm thinking of sort of things that schools can do as a matter of policy, is it less a policy question than a culture question? And probably a little bit of both, but what I'm hearing, at least, is that the big changes could be, or at least what I'm taking away, maybe not what I'm hearing. The big changes are ones where, like, hey, everyone, we need to understand this is the world that different people are encountering. This is the mentorship role that people are taking on. This is the dynamic. And so many of these things are just about, like, getting it, sort of just being aware as ways of improving it. And so I guess, when I'm just thinking about, like, policy changes, you mentioned one, teaching evaluations, but just it seems that it's I'm hearing that it's less of a policy change thing than a culture awareness problem.
I think that's right, and I think that's because what we started with in this conversation, which is you talking about how so much is unwritten or unknown unless you're in it, and so there isn't a formal policy, for example, that says, if you want to be hired at our school, you have to have gone to an elite school, been on law review at your school, done a federal appellate clerkship, and increasingly now done a fellowship or a VAP, and have a PhD, right? So there are some schools that sort of talk about how they prefer those candidates, but there certainly isn't a policy that that's who we're going to hire. And yet we've seen over time that there is a preference, certainly, for candidates that sort of fit that profile. And so I think this would be an important place to consider a culture change, right? Especially now. I mean, literally right now, where so many schools have instituted hiring freezes. And even in the last few years, where hiring was really constricted, a lot of schools have been unwilling to, from their perspective, I think, take a risk. Consider a candidate who maybe doesn't fit the traditional profile, who didn't follow that kind of expected path to legal academia. And so by not doing that, I think we're missing opportunities to bring in really tremendous scholars who actually may have very different perspectives that could be really useful, specifically because they took a different path, right? So what does it mean that you didn't plan since law school to be a law professor, right? How are the experiences that you've gained over, the 2 or 5 or 10 years that you've pursued some different experiences? How can those actually inform your pedagogical approach or the way in which you approach your scholarship? Most likely it's going to bring something really unique and exciting that is different than what many other scholars are doing. And I think at most schools, that's generally seen as a plus, right? And yet it's going to be very difficult, I think, to cultivate that sort of junior scholar if we're picking mostly people who have followed a very traditional path. And so you're right, that there's no policy that says you're required to do these 6 things before we'll really consider hiring you. And yet the culture tends to be, well, if we look at these 2 candidates and they look really similar, but this one has a clerkship and did a VAP and has a PhD, ironically, even if they've produced the same amount of scholarship, I feel like at many, which is going to be almost impossible for the person who's been working at a big law firm, as compared to someone with a PhD, I think many schools will still say, well, it's going to be less of a risk to go with the PhD. Let's take that person instead. And I'm sure that, it's not like that person won't produce incredible scholarship going forward. But if we're thinking about how to do things differently, if we're thinking about how to make a culture change, that's, I think, what it's going to take.
Great. I wanted to turn to a somewhat different topic, which is going back on the episodes I've had so far. I started with Akil Amar, and then I had Jamal Green, and just some amazing people. But feedback a reaction I got by email mostly from viewers and listeners was along the lines of, yeah, this is what the world looks like if you're at Yale or if you're at Columbia, but we're having different experiences. There's 200 or so, I forget the exact number, law schools depending on how you count. And so you've been at a couple of different schools. You've visited at several schools, and I was hoping you could shed a little more light on this question of how the experience is different at different law schools. Maybe this is from the book and the study. It could be, or your own personal experience just having seen different schools. But I was the question I got, and I guess I'll take the question that was emailed to me and I'll pose it to you if this works, which is, does the experience that people are talking about of the world of a law professor at the Yales and the Stanfords, is it the same experience as people at different law schools? How does it vary, especially for those that are interested in being professors? And maybe this is the best way of focusing my meandering question, which is, I've gotten emails from people that are interested in becoming law professors that say, I'm not going to be a professor at Harvard. I'm not going to be a professor at NYU. I think I could get a job at, my local school or, one of the schools in my state. What would that world be like? Can you shed light on how much the kind of, law professors tend to be so U.S. News ranking obsessed, but how much that matters, how much the experience is different at different places?
Yeah, I mean, I can try. There's from the data, it doesn't seem in terms of the challenges that we've talked about so far today, it doesn't seem like they're dramatically different or really any different at all based on tier. So for the methodology for my study, I was very careful to include samples from a broad range of areas. So like regionally, also tier of school, junior scholars, senior scholars. The women of color in the sample are Black, Latina, Native American, Asian American, Middle Eastern, and multiracial. And so I was very careful about selecting within each of these groups and other domains as well. And it doesn't seem like, the pushback that women of color faculty are getting at, like the local schools that you're talking about is any different at the top tier schools. The women of color who are teaching at top schools are challenged in the classroom as much as those who are teaching at more access oriented schools. The example of heap eating that is the most common in this study is some version of, I said this thing at a faculty meeting and nobody said anything about it, and then a male colleague of mine repeated it a couple minutes later and everybody said what a great idea it was. Right? That's happening at maybe not at every school, but at schools regardless of their selectivity of students, right, or however else we want to rank them. So it doesn't seem like there's much of a change. I think there are some resource differences certainly at schools, both with regard to the faculty members and often with regard to the students. The students at more elite schools tend to be those who can focus their energies entirely on school. Like it's their job and their life for the most part, right? Like what they are there to do is go to school, and that's what they spend all their time doing. Whereas at more access-oriented schools, often they're students who are still working, either part-time or full-time. They're taking care of children or elderly parents. Many students are commuting, up to an hour or more a day to attend some of these schools. And so it's a very different experience for the students as well as for faculty members. That's, I think, maybe happening a little bit less now. It's as sort of bar pass pressures have affected even elite schools, as funding challenges have made it difficult for, I think, a lot of faculty members to, travel to conferences back in the day when we used to be able to travel to conferences. I think that's equalized things somewhat. But the challenges that I note in the study are ubiquitous. They're happening at elite schools at least as much as the more access-oriented ones.
Right. We're getting close to the end of time. I want to keep going, but I know I've been told keep it short, Orin. So I wanted to end by talking about what you're doing next year. I understand you're doing a fellowship with the American Bar Foundation that looks super interesting. I was hoping you could say more about it.
Yeah, so I'm the Newcomb Chair in Diversity and Law for the American Bar Foundation next year, and I am really thrilled. They are a really vibrant scholarly community that conducts empirical research primarily on law students and legal education as a whole, really, and the legal profession. And so, as part of my work there, I can continue to build on what I've been doing with the book. So, um, in addition to my regular academic position, I'm the director of LESI, as you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation today. And the work I do with LESI is really an opportunity to kind of get a finger on the pulse of legal education as a whole from a student perspective. So at LESI, we house probably the largest data set in all of legal education. We have almost 400,000 responses from law students over 16 years. We conduct an annual survey every spring, and we ask everything from time usage to overall satisfaction to the frequency and quality of interactions with faculty and staff and classmates. Um, and so, in one of our recent annual reports, we noted that 93% of law students believe that their professors care about their success in learning, which I was thrilled to see because so many of us work really hard to convey how much we care about our students. And so, as we're moving now to, at least this past spring has been much more of an online model. And then, for next year, I know Berkeley is headed that direction. And I think many other schools will do the same, even if some schools maybe start out meeting in person. I think it's very likely that they will at some point during the year have at least some courses online. How do we get our students to continue to recognize how much we care about them? Right? In the classroom, when you're meeting in person, there's always a few minutes before class, a few minutes after class. You see students in the hallway. I know where students hang out. I know that I can go there, pretty much at any time of day. And there will be some students I know who are there who I can sort of check in with. You can't really do that. When classes are online, you have to make a purposeful effort to engage with students. And we know from the research that you and I have talked about already today that that burden tends to fall most heavily on women of color faculty. Now, if that burden has always fallen on women of color, it's only going to continue to intensify as it gets more difficult to make those really meaningful connections. Now, if you want to talk with a student, you have to sort of set up a Zoom time to do it, right? You're not just going to accidentally or maybe it seems like an accident to them, even if I'm trying to be purposeful about it. But you're not going to just run into one another. And so, when we think about the ongoing challenges now because of the pandemic, how is that going to affect women as a whole and women of color specifically in legal academia? We've seen, for example, in other fields with peer-reviewed journals, that submissions have dropped significantly for women in these other fields. Law review, we follow sort of a different timeline and format, as you well know. And so I've talked actually with some law review editors and with other scholars about how to put together a study that sort of looks at some similar things with regard to law reviews. What is the gender disparity? Because I expect there will be one. With publishing rates for women going forward. And, of course, as things are intensifying at work, women have always been more of the academic caretakers at work, organizing events and setting up meetings, meeting with students, being on, a number of committees. All of those things are increasing. We have more processes to work out, more meetings that we need to have. And this is all happening, of course, while schools are closed for the most part. Summer camps are closed. Summer tends to be a time where many scholars can really devote a lot of time to their scholarship. So many of the women in my sample talked about really not having that much time during the school year to get work done because they're sort of pulled in so many directions, but they carve out time to get their scholarship done in the summer. Well, I'm expecting that that's going to be a lot more difficult to do this summer than it ever has been before because, kids are at home. nobody is coming into your house to, help you cook or clean or, provide any sort of the caregiving services that they might have been able to provide before.
Right.
Your parents or your in-laws might need help getting groceries, and those burdens have always fallen to women. So we're in this very difficult position now where women are, I think, going to be expected or are currently expected to do more at work in terms of the service responsibilities and are doing more out of necessity at home. And so, that I think that it's going to be impossible to maintain any sort of scholarly productivity. And so the patterns that we've seen in other fields, I think, will be very similar in law. And so that's one of the things that I'm interested in following.
I want you to know I've done my part by having no scholarly productivity for the last 3 months. Anything I can do to help.
One of the big solutions too that when you were asking earlier about structural solutions that I have thought a lot about is recognizing different types of service work and rewarding it. And so, I've certainly been thinking, this is the 7th episode that you've produced for this show. And I know it takes a lot of time and effort to sort of cultivate, who's going to be next on the list, who's the next guest, how do I, prepare for that meeting. Maybe this should count as something too, right? In the same way that writing an op-ed maybe should count, or being engaged in the community should count. There are so many ways in which what many of us do is actually a real enrichment to the legal academic community. And, if you think more broadly about the community, I think you're providing a service, not just to law professors, but to aspiring faculty members. You're sort of demystifying the process, I hope. And so maybe you're not getting as much writing done, but could this not count, as sort of a project of yours for the summer that is really valuable and provides a service too?
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. And it keeps me off of Twitter for an hour a week. That's always a good thing. All right. We're unfortunately out of time. This has been fantastic. I'm going to, again, plug the book, Unequal Profession, Race and Gender in Legal Academia. I loved it. I thought it was just incredibly revealing. And it was just wonderful to have you on the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. I loved being here.